Hey guys, Trip here, and I'm a racist. Thankfully, my racism is limited to imaginary people, so as far as I know, no one important is getting hurt. If you've been watching the podcast, you'd know I've been dabbling in Skyrim again, so I'm probably going to have a lot to say about the Elder Scrolls in the next few weeks. Today we're talking about Nords, and if you read the title of this episode, you can assume it's not going to be flattering. I want to analyze the Nords, and try to figure out why I found them so underwhelming. But more than that, I want to talk about world and culture building in video games, and where I think Skyrim went wrong. When designing a fantasy culture, it's important to provide depth, context, and intriguing character quirks to hook you in. The Elder Scrolls has always been a bit frustrating in this regard. In the books, lore, and dialogue, we're often given bizarre and fantastically creative descriptions for each race, only for their culture to be toned down by the time we experience it. The Nords in Skyrim are one of the most severe examples of this. I was always intrigued by the Nords in previous games. They seem to have this curious Norse culture, living nomadic lives centered around longhouses called mead halls. They supposedly lived in a savage land of constant violence, infested with were-creatures and other monsters. They were described in books, lore, and even by themselves as wild, untamed adventurers who reveled in violence. The Dark Elves in particular literally believed the Nords to be demons who came to steal their land. Even if some of this was exaggerated, I always got the sense that there was a core of truth behind it. If nothing else, it was interesting. As with every race in the Elder Scrolls, some Nords were more normal than others, living in relatively civilized kingdoms like Solitude and Windhelm. But throughout this series, I always got the sense that most Nords were wild, uncivilized, and became more primal the further north you went. But by the time of Skyrim, it seems most of the flavor was sucked out of the Nords. In the 200 years between Oblivion and Skyrim, the Nords apparently settled down. The way they live now isn't all that different from Bretons or Imperials. Gone are the days of longhouses and tribes, a land infested with werebeasts, and a culture marked by exploration, adventure, and gleeful violence. The Nords are actually pretty normal now. Their arrogance, stubbornness, and xenophobia, however, are still intact. But without anything interesting to balance out their negative traits, they feel less like three-dimensional characters and more like annoying assholes to me. They effectively retconned all the intriguing stuff while leaving in all of their character flaws. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Trip, clearly the Nords changed over 200 years. The old lore was probably biased and inaccurate anyway. Well, honestly, none of that really matters to me. The changes to the Nords were the result of conscious choices by the developers. You can find any number of excuses for why they did this, but at the end of the day, the Nords just aren't that interesting to me anymore. The other argument I see is that Bethesda had to tone things down for casual audiences. I've always rejected that argument. Casual audiences just want a fun game. If people were scared off by weird races and fantastical environments, then why do we have successful games with talking cows, Lovecraftian witch creatures, and whatever the fuck this thing is? No one is going to avoid a game because the world is too interesting. But blandness isn't even the main problem I have with the Nords. To me, they're just insufferable hypocrites. If you don't remember, here's a basic rundown of the situation the Nords are in at the time of Skyrim. The Nords, and most humans of the Empire, worship the first Emperor Talos as a god. The Elves of the Eldameri Dominion, a rival empire, see Talos as a genocidal tyrant and go to war with the Empire in part to force them to stop worshipping him. In the end, a treaty is signed and Talos worship is banned. Many Nords, however, refuse to accept this, and about half of them decide to secede from the Empire, starting a bloody civil war. Now, on the surface, you can sympathize with the Nords here. That is until you start to think about it for too long. The Nords' response to their god being banned, a god who preaches law, order, and unity under the Empire, is to abandon the Empire. Not only that, but it's made explicitly clear in the game that the Elves want the war to go on for as long as possible, and to divide the Empire so it will be easier to conquer. They're even manipulating Ulfric Stormcloak, the leader of the rebellion. Any sort of internal strife is just playing into their hands. But even if the rebellion itself doesn't make sense, you can still sympathize with the Nords' basic motivations. They want sovereignty and religious freedom. That's pretty reasonable. The hypocrisy of the Nords is most blatantly displayed in Markarth. Markarth and the area surrounding it known as the Reach is a region annexed from High Rock, the land of the Bretons. It was originally the kingdom of a tribe of witchmen who are now an oppressed underclass subjugated by the Nords. 20 years before the game starts, the witchmen rise up and take their land back, only to be squashed by Ulfric Stormcloak and his makeshift army. So, to recap, the rebellion founded on religious freedom and protecting the rights of a native race to rule their own land began as an army of invaders conquering another people and taking away their right to religious freedom. What? And it's not just the rebel Stormcloaks who flaunt their hypocrisy. Markarth itself is aligned with the Empire, and the people there still feel persecuted by the elves enforcing their beliefs on them. All the while, the natives live beneath them in abject poverty, most aren't allowed to own land, and the government is openly corrupt and harasses them constantly. You can find examples of this all throughout the game, where the Nords as a whole are either xenophobic, ignorant, closed-minded, or just plain unlikable. Markarth is just a single microcosm of what I see as the Nords' insufferable hypocrisy. They whine and complain about the elves taking away their sovereignty and religion, while they themselves do the exact same thing to the natives. But I get it. I get what they were going for. They wanted the Nords to be a little hypocritical, just like people are in real life. But the game rarely calls them out on this directly. We rarely get to side against the Nords, and they never seem to face the consequences for their actions in a meaningful way. The game expects us to sympathize with them all the way through. This gets at the difficult balance between creating a culture that's realistically flawed and a culture that's flat out unsympathetic. The confused writing of Skyrim forces the Nords into the latter category. One thing I can't stand in fiction is when a creator forces their perceptions on the audience, and when that perception doesn't line up with what's actually happening. There's this cognitive dissonance between how the Nords are behaving and how the game wants you to feel about them. Whether you're an Imperial or a Stormcloak, you're expected to root for the Nords, to see them as heroic and noble and wild and free, but so much of that has been toned down from previous games that all we're left with are a bunch of hypocrites with a victim complex. The game keeps imposing these ideas upon the player without backing them up. Compare this, for example, to Morrowind. The Dunmer existed to be hated just as much as they existed to be loved. From the get-go, it's made clear that the Dunmer aren't intended to be the heroes, or the victims, or even altogether sympathetic. You're not necessarily expected to fall in love with them as a people. You're meant to find them bizarre, fascinating, and intriguing. The developer's intention is in perfect sync with my perception. Or for a more recent example, look at the way the Altmer are portrayed in Skyrim. Their actions and behavior perfectly sync up with the tone, context, and what the writers are trying to convey. Do I wish the Thalmor were more three-dimensional than the mustache-twirling villains we got? Of course, but at least their portrayal was consistent. What I want is for the writers to show as well as tell, and for what they're showing to sync up with what I'm being told. If the writing were more self-aware, if the Nords had more personality and were as wild and untamed as the previous game suggested, then their actions would have made more sense to me. As it stands, I just hate the Nords. There's a right way and a wrong way to create almost anything you want in fiction, and I think with a few tweaks, the Nords would have been a lot more interesting. So what do you guys think? Do you like the Nords and think I'm crazy? What are your favorite and least favorite races in fantasy? Let me know in the comments. But yeah, that was just something that was on my mind. Hey guys, Trip here. If you liked that video, why not watch some more? Hit that like button and make sure to share this video on Reddit and social media. If you want to see more Psychotrip, check out my Patreon. There you'll find all of my videos, as well as articles I've written for Comicsverse. If you like what you see, think about donating $1 or $2. Turns out imaginary people are real, and they're up in arms over my latest comments. I need to pay legal fees. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.